Chen's world was a universe of ochre-stained parchment and faded indigo lines. His workshop, a meticulously ordered sanctuary, smelled of aged paper, fine India ink, and the faint, metallic tang of old brass instruments. Here, amidst towering stacks of forgotten atlases and the delicate scroll of ancient cartouches, he found his solace. He charted the vanished rivers of medieval kingdoms, traced the forgotten trade routes of lost empires, and resurrected the ghost towns of the American West, all from the quiet solitude of his desk. He rarely ventured beyond the perimeter of his carefully constructed life, preferring the company of dead explorers and the silent narratives of their maps. Then came the letter. It arrived not through the usual channels, but hand-delivered by a courier who seemed surprised to find a residence tucked so far back from the main road. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, bearing a seal Chen didn't recognize. Inside, the solicitor's prose was crisp, formal, and utterly disruptive. A distant relative, a great-aunt he'd never known, had passed. His estate, surprisingly, included a property Chen was now heir to, a lighthouse. A lighthouse. The word hung in the air, foreign and incongruous in his world of continental interiors. It was described as remote, dilapidated, perched on a promontory known locally as the Whisper's Edge. The name itself carried a faint, unsettling resonance, like a chord struck in a hollow chamber. Chen, despite his reclusive nature, felt a prickle of something akin to intellectual curiosity. A forgotten structure, a solitary sentinel guarding an unseen secret, it was, in its own way, a map waiting to be drawn. A unique project. He spent weeks meticulously preparing. His precise cartographer's tools, compasses, dividers, magnifying loops, were packed alongside more practical items: heavy-duty flashlights, a coil of stout rope, a first aid kit. His sedan, usually reserved for short trips to the library or hardware store, was loaded for a journey of significant distance. He found himself poring over satellite images and topographical maps of the coastal region, tracing the jagged outline of the land, the isolated finger of rock reaching into the sea. The Whisper's Edge. It looked less like a point of guidance and more like a final destination. The drive stretched into days. The landscape slowly shed its familiar, rolling hills for something craggier, more austere. Towns became sparser, their buildings weathered and their inhabitants' faces etched with the hard lines of coastal living. He passed through a desolate stretch of road, marked by a solitary, ramshackle building serving as a border checkpoint. The official's gaze lingered a moment too long on Chen's packed vehicle, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before he waved Chen through. Fog began to gather in the low-lying valleys, clinging to the skeletal trees like damp shrouds. Finally, the road dwindled to a narrow, gravel track, barely wide enough for his car. It snaked upward, clinging precariously to the side of a cliff, the ocean a churning gray expanse far below. The fog, which had been a distant threat, now enveloped him, thick and cloying. He drove slowly, his headlights carving twin tunnels through the swirling vapor, the only sound the crunch of tires on loose stone and the distant, mournful wail of the wind. Then, through a momentary thinning of the mist, he saw it. The lighthouse. It was not the elegant, pristine tower he might have imagined. Its lantern room, high above, was a gaping, empty socket, devoid of glass or lens. It stood like a petrified giant, a forgotten sentinel against an unforgiving sea, its base battered by centuries of spray. There were no other structures, no signs of recent human activity, only the lighthouse, grim and solitary. A shiver, unrelated to the damp air, traced its way up Chen's spine. This was isolation on a scale he had only ever experienced through the silent pages of his maps. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was profound, broken. Only by the rhythmic roar of the waves crashing against the unseen cliffs below and the persistent, low moan of the wind, which seemed to carry a faint, almost imperceptible hum. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and damp earth, but underneath it, he detected another odor, faint, metallic, like old iron mixed with something organic and deeply buried. The fog swirled around him, obscuring the horizon, making the world shrink to the immediate vicinity of the tower. He felt a profound sense of diminishment, a sudden awareness of his own smallness against the raw power of the land and the sea. He walked toward the lighthouse, his gaze drawn to its base. The stonework was ancient, scarred, bearing strange, deeply carved symbols that seemed less like decorative flourishes and more like protective wards. They were worn almost smooth by time and weather, but their unsettling geometry was still discernible. This was not a lighthouse built for beauty or even primarily for guidance, he realized. It was built for endurance, for containment. The main door, massive and crafted from blackened oak banded with rusted iron, stood slightly ajar. A low, persistent groan of metal against stone accompanied his approach, as if the structure itself was sighing. He pushed it open further. A wave of frigid, stagnant air washed over him, carrying that same peculiar, metallic earthy scent, now stronger. The interior was a cavern of gloom, dust motes dancing in the faint light filtering through unseen cracks. His cartographer's mind, always seeking order and understanding, immediately noted the unusual thickness of the walls, the absence of windows on the lower levels, the strange, echoing quality of the space. This was not merely a neglected building. It was a place designed with a purpose he couldn't yet fathom, a purpose that felt heavy and suffocating. Chen stepped inside, his footsteps echoing unnervingly on the cold stone floor. The great door, caught by a sudden gust of wind, swung shut behind him with a resounding thud. The salt-laced air, thick with the scent of brine and decaying timber, stung Chen's nostrils the moment he stepped inside the lighthouse. It was a visceral assault, a stark contrast to the sterile calm of his workshop. Here, amidst the echoing vastness of the ground floor, his determination was tested by the sheer scale of the neglect. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light filtering through grime-caked windows, illuminating spiderwebs draped like forgotten tapestries. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant, rhythmic crash of waves against the promontory. He began his survey with the meticulousness of a cartographer charting unknown territory. His hands, accustomed to the delicate touch of parchment, now traced the rough, cold stone of the walls. The central spiral staircase, a rusted iron helix disappearing into the gloom above, beckoned. Each step on the metal treads groaned under his weight, a cacophony of protest that reverberated through the hollow tower. On the second level, where the keeper's quarters might once have been, he found a narrow passage leading to a smaller, circular room. It was here, partially obscured by a thick layer of plaster that had crumbled away, that he first noticed them, carvings. Not decorative, not nautical, but something far older, far stranger. Jagged lines, interlocking symbols that resembled no alphabet he knew, deeply incised into the stone. They didn't seem intended to adorn, but to mark. He ran a finger over the sharp edges, a faint, metallic taste blooming on his tongue. Just peculiar local folklore, he told himself, or perhaps the idle etchings of a board keeper. Further up, on what he estimated was the fourth level, he discovered a chamber unlike any other. Its entrance was not merely boarded up, but sealed with a heavy, gray mortar that looked almost like lead, reinforced with thick, pitted iron straps bolted into the surrounding stone. This was no simple storage room. This was a deliberate, powerful act of containment. As he continued his ascent, the air grew heavier, denser, as if the very light was being absorbed by the ancient stone. A faint rustling, like dry leaves skittering across a floor, when there were no leaves. A sigh, barely audible, carried on a gust of wind that didn't seem to penetrate the thick walls. He paused, straining his ears, but the sounds vanished as quickly as they came, leaving only the relentless sigh of the ocean. He attributed them to the settling of the old structure, the wind whistling through unseen cracks, the tricks of an isolated mind. He reached the lantern room, the glass panes opaque with salt spray and age. The panoramic view, though obscured, hinted at the vast, indifferent ocean stretching to the horizon. Below, the promontory was a jagged scar against the churning gray. It was here, tucked away in a dusty, built-in cabinet behind a rusted control panel, that he found it, a leather-bound logbook, its pages brittle and yellowed. It wasn't a standard ship's log, but a meticulous record, dated from decades past, filled with dense, looping script. Most entries were mundane, detailing lamp maintenance or weather observations. But some entries were different. His eyes scanned the faded ink, picking out peculiar phrases. Maintaining the integrity of the barrier, one entry read. Another, dated years later, mentioned strengthening the seals against ingress. Then, on a particularly worn page, almost at the back, he found a diagram. It wasn't a blueprint of the lighthouse, but a schematic of some internal mechanism or structural anomaly, labeled with an archaic, almost occult-like script. And beneath it, in bold, unnerving lettering, were the words, "The border checkpoint." Chen frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. A border checkpoint? Here? On an isolated promontory miles from any navigable land route or populated area? The term made no sense in a conventional context. He reread the entry, then the surrounding ones, searching for clarification. There was none. Only vague references to containment protocols and monitoring energy fluctuations. The logbook didn't describe a boundary for people or goods, but something far more abstract, far more unsettling. The old keeper, or whoever penned these entries, had clearly believed this lighthouse served a purpose beyond guiding ships. This time, it wasn't a rustle or a sigh. It was too close, too deliberate to be the wind. He spun around, his heart giving an involuntary lurch, but the vast, empty space of the lantern room offered no explanation. He peered into the gloom, a sudden, primal apprehension seizing him. He was no longer merely exploring an old building, he was intruding. And something, ancient and patient, had noticed his presence. Chen stared at the faded inscription, the words border checkpoint refusing to align with the desolate reality outside the lighthouse windows. His mind churned, trying to force a logical explanation into the space where only stark isolation existed. A border implied two sides, a division, a passage. What could it possibly mean here, on this lonely spire of rock? He traced the letters with a calloused fingertip, the parchment cool and brittle beneath his touch. He reread the surrounding entries, hunting for any context, any forgotten detail that might illuminate this baffling term. There was nothing. Just the keeper's terse, increasingly fractured observations about the weather, the dwindling supplies, and the oppressive silence. A frustrated sigh escaped him. This lighthouse, this inheritance, was proving to be a labyrinth of unanswerable questions. He slammed the heavy logbook shut, the thud echoing in the small study. The sound, amplified by the close space, made him jump. He ran a hand over his tired face, the stubble rough against his palm. He needed more. He needed something definitive, something that could cut through the growing fog in his own mind. His gaze swept the room, searching for an overlooked detail, a hidden compartment, anything that might have escaped his initial, more cursory inspections. The study was sparse, a heavy wooden desk, a few shelves of mildewed maritime charts, and a stone fireplace. He knelt by the hearth, running his hands over the rough-hewn stones, feeling for any irregularity. Most were firmly mortared, cold and unyielding. He pressed harder. His breath hitched. With a grunt of effort, he pried the stone free. It came away with a faint scraping sound, revealing a small, concealed cavity. Inside, wrapped in a brittle, oilskin cloth, lay a book. Not a logbook, but a small, leather-bound journal, its cover cracked and peeling, the edges water-stained and warped. A faint, earthy scent, a mix of damp rock and decaying paper, wafted from the opening. Chen pulled it out, handling it with extreme care. The oilskin crackled as he unwrapped it, revealing pages yellowed to the color of old teeth. The leather binding was nearly detached, and several pages were loose, threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. This was not an official record, this was something private, something hidden. He settled back into the desk chair, the journal resting heavy in his hands, a tangible piece of another's forgotten life. He opened it to the first legible entry, the ink faded but still discernible. The handwriting was neat initially, then grew increasingly frantic and sprawling as the entries progressed. August 14th. Another week. The fog has swallowed the horizon whole. A man could go mad out here. Chen keep telling myself it's the solitude, the salt air. Chen read on, the low hum of the wind outside the thick glass seeming to intensify with each word. The keeper, unnamed, recounted mundane details at first, the weather, the state of the lamp, the endless watch. But slowly, subtly, the tone began to shift. September 3rd, heard it again last night. A low thrum, deep in the rock, beneath the tower. Not the tide. Too regular. Too deliberate. It felt like something vast shifting below. Chen felt a prickle of unease. He remembered the strange vibrations, the subtle tremors that sometimes ran through the lighthouse's stone foundations. He had dismissed them as geological shifts, the natural settling of an ancient structure. September 19th. Or perhaps they don't. Chen see movement at the periphery, just beyond the lamp's reach. Shapes that aren't there when Chen turn my head. It feels like eyes upon me, pressing in from the mist. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. The way the light seemed to dim and waver, the feeling of being watched, these were not unique to this journal. They were his own experiences, echoing back at him from the brittle pages. October 5th. A deep, resonant hum that vibrates in my teeth. It speaks of forgotten things, of memories fading like old photographs. It wants them. It wants to consume them. Chen's hands began to tremble. This wasn't paranoia, this was a shared nightmare. The journal entries grew shorter, more disjointed, the script slanting wildly across the page. October 18th. My name. I sometimes forget my own name. The fog outside is thick, but the fog inside is thicker still. It's the cost. The price of being here. The deep voice demands it. It feeds. November 2nd. The dreams. Not dreams. Memories that aren't mine, slipping into my head like sea spray through a crack. Images of faces I don't know, places I've never seen. It's stealing my own past, replacing it with its echoes. This was no ordinary haunting. This was something ancient, something that preyed on the very essence of human identity. It was here, in this lighthouse, and it was feeding. He flipped to the last page, his heart hammering against his ribs. The ink was barely legible, smeared and frantic. The sentence began, then dissolved into a chaotic scrawl, ending abruptly midword. November 10th. It's coming for the... The rest was a chaotic tangle of ink, as if the pen had been torn from the keeper's hand, or as if the keeper himself had simply ceased to be. Chen stared at the unfinished sentence, the implied horror far more potent than any explicit description. The keeper hadn't just left, he had been taken. And Chen, in his determined efforts to restore this place, had not only woken the entity, but had also stepped into the exact same trap. He was the next offering, the next memory to be consumed. The unfinished sentence in the keeper's logbook had been a physical blow, leaving Chen gasping for air in the dim, salt-laced silence of the tower. Taken. The word echoed in the hollow space between his ears, a chilling counterpoint to the distant moan of the foghorn. He hadn't just stumbled upon a forgotten history, he had walked into an ongoing predation. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing in, carrying the faint, metallic tang of old blood and something else, something impossibly ancient, like dust from a dead star. He spent the rest of the evening in a state of agitated vigilance, every creak of the old structure, every gust of wind rattling the lantern room glass, a potential threat. The next morning, the lighthouse felt different. The familiar hum of the generator seemed off-key, a discordant thrum that vibrated in his teeth. He found his meticulously organized maps scattered across his drafting table, not just disturbed, but rearranged. Lines he had drawn were smudged, coastlines subtly altered, familiar landmarks shifted by impossible degrees. A mountain range he knew intimately now curved inland, a river flowed backward. He stared, bewildered, his hands trembling as he tried to smooth the paper. Had he done this in his sleep? Later, while preparing a meager meal, he reached for a specific ceramic mug, his favorite, only to find it gone. He searched the small galley, his frustration mounting. It wasn't just misplaced, it was gone. Then, as he turned from the empty cupboard, he saw it, sitting innocently on the counter, right where he had looked a moment before. A shiver traced its way down his spine. He hadn't seen it. He knew he hadn't. The entity, he realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't just a presence, it was a participant. It was playing with him. The psychological assault intensified. He would hear the distinct click of his own camera shutter when no camera was in hand, or the rustle of blueprints from a room he knew was empty. His memories began to fray at the edges. He'd recall a conversation with a colleague, a specific phrase, a shared laugh, only for the details to shift, the person's face blurring, their words twisting into something menacing and unfamiliar. Had he ever actually had that conversation? Or was it a fabrication, woven into the fabric of his past by something insidious? He found himself scrutinizing old photographs, trying to recall the names of faces that now seemed alien, their expressions subtly mocking. He needed to talk to someone. Anyone. The isolation, once a cherished companion, was now a suffocating shroud. He made his way to the small communication room, a cramped space tucked off the main spiral staircase, where he kept his satellite phone and a small, battered marine radio. This was his last tangible link, his border checkpoint to the world beyond the fog. He switched on the radio, the static a familiar hiss, and tried to raise the nearest coastal station. Nothing. He adjusted the frequency, checked the antenna connection, his movements growing more frantic. Just static. A low, persistent hum beneath the white noise, like a distant, hungry growl. He pressed the power button. He tried again, harder. He checked the battery, swapped it out for a fully charged spare. He slapped the phone against his palm, a desperate, childish gesture. Dead. Both of them. The radio, the phone, his last lifeline. He was truly alone. The lighthouse, once a sanctuary, had become a cage, its walls now closing in not just physically, but around his very mind. He could feel the entity's presence coalesce, no longer just an implied threat, but a palpable weight, pressing against his skull. He gripped the dead phone, his knuckles white. He stumbled back, hitting the cold stone wall, his breath catching in his throat. He hadn't just stumbled upon a forgotten history, he'd stumbled into a trap. Taken. The word clawed at Chen's throat, stealing the air he so desperately needed. He pressed his palms against the cool, rough pages of the logbook, the ink a stark, damning declaration against the yellowed paper. The distant moan of the foghorn, once a mournful companion, now sounded like a lament for something irrevocably lost. Chen forced himself to breathe, slow and deliberate, the salty tang in the air suddenly metallic, like the taste of fear. He flipped back through the preceding entries, his eyes scanning for context, for any clue as to what taken truly meant. The keeper's handwriting, neat and precise initially, devolved into a frantic scrawl. Dates blurred, sentences fragmented into desperate pleas and warnings. The whispers grow louder, even the light struggles to hold them back. It pulls at the edges of thought, unraveling what was once clear. The binding weakens. Chen feel its hunger. The true purpose, not to guide, but to keep contained. Chen's gaze snagged on that last phrase. Not to guide, but to keep contained. A cold wave washed over him, deeper than the sea spray that occasionally misted the lantern room windows. He reread it, the words echoing in the cavernous space. He had assumed, like any reasonable person, that a lighthouse existed for navigation. But what if its function was entirely different? He closed the logbook, the leather cover feeling suddenly heavy, imbued with a sinister weight. His eyes swept the lantern room, seeing it anew. The intricate clockwork mechanism, usually a source of mechanical fascination, now appeared foreboding, its rhythmic grinding taking on a sinister pulse. He moved to the outer wall, running his hand over the rough stone. It was thicker than necessary, far more substantial than typical lighthouse construction. He remembered the blueprints he'd studied, the unusual foundation, the deep, reinforced subterranean levels he hadn't yet explored. He dismissed them as over-engineering, a quaint relic of a bygone era. Now, they screamed of fortification. Driven by a growing unease, Chen descended the spiraling staircase. Each step down felt like a descent into a deeper layer of understanding, a crossing of an invisible threshold. Here, etched directly into the ancient masonry, were symbols he hadn't noticed before. They weren't decorative, nor were they navigational markers. They were interlocking geometric patterns, lines that seemed to twist and bind, radiating from a central point. They felt less like art and more like a warning, a spell woven into the very fabric of the tower. He traced a finger over one particularly complex design, and a faint vibration hummed beneath his skin, a resonance that prickled the hairs on his arms. He found another section of the logbook, tucked away in a rusted metal box beneath a workbench, its pages brittle with age. This was an older hand, more formal, chronicling the lighthouse's construction. The site chosen for its unique confluence of elemental isolation. The light must be maintained at all costs, for its cessation would mean the unraveling of the ward. The true barrier. Not of stone but of concentrated will, projected outward to the border checkpoint, keeping the bound thing within its designated sphere. The phrase border checkpoint struck Chen with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't about ships navigating safe passage, it was about containing something that threatened to spill out. The light wasn't a guide, it was a cage. The entire structure, from its deep foundations to its towering lantern, was a complex, ritualistic prison. And the light, that singular, powerful beam, was the lock. He remembered the flickering, the moments of dimness he'd attributed to old wiring or faulty bulbs. They weren't signs of his isolation taking hold, they were symptoms of the lock failing. He scrambled back up the winding stairs, his breath catching in his chest, a frantic urgency propelling him. He looked at the Fresnel lens, no longer a majestic beacon, but a desperate, failing shield. He looked at the mechanism, its rhythmic grind now sounding like a death rattle. The light. It was struggling. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a suppressed energy, a palpable tension. The entity wasn't just in the lighthouse, it was bound by it, held at bay by the very light Chen had been working to restore. His efforts to fix the lighthouse, to make it shine brighter, stronger, had been a terrible, unwitting mistake. He hadn't been restoring a beacon, he had been disturbing a failing ward. He had not only awakened the entity, but he had also, in his ignorant determination, made himself its new, singular focus. The light was failing, and the border checkpoint was eroding. Whatever was contained here, whatever had taken the previous keeper, was now reaching for him. The phrase border checkpoint solidified in Chen's mind, cold and sharp as a sliver of ice. It wasn't about ships navigating safe passage, it was about containing something that threatened to spill out. The thought had chilled him to the bone, but now, a steely resolve began to temper the fear. He had to understand how it was a cage, and what, precisely, was trying to break free. He stood in the main chamber, the vast lens mechanism above him a silent, skeletal titan. Dust motes danced in the single beam of his headlamp, but the air felt heavy, almost viscous. A deep, resonant groan vibrated through the very stones beneath his boots, a sound that seemed to originate from the bedrock itself, not the wind. It was a complaint, a rumble of ancient displeasure. Chen clutched the tattered diagram he'd found, tracing the crude lines that depicted the lighthouse's unusual foundations. This wasn't merely a structure, it was an elaborate lock, and he, in his ignorance, had been turning the key. A sudden, sharp crack splintered the relative quiet. Chen flinched, his gaze snapping upwards. A fissure, fine as a spider web, had just appeared on the ceiling arch directly above the main entrance. The groan intensified, becoming a low, grinding shriek that set his teeth on edge. Then, a sudden, violent lurch. The entire tower swayed, not with the gentle rock of a building in a storm, but with a jarring, unnatural twist. Tools hanging on hooks along the perimeter of the chamber clattered, then one by one, screwdrivers, wrenches, and hammers launched themselves from their perches with an invisible force, striking the far wall with metallic clangs. A heavy, cast-iron bracket, meant to support a lantern, tore itself free from the stone with a sound like tearing flesh, embedding itself with a thud in the wooden doorframe 20 feet away. Chen scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of fear. This was no longer just his mind playing tricks. This was real. Tangible. The air grew frigid, a sudden drop in temperature that stole the breath from his lungs. A faint, metallic tang, like static electricity before a lightning strike, permeated the space. He felt his ears pop, a sharp, painful sensation, as if the very atmospheric pressure inside the lighthouse was being manipulated. He saw it then, on the floor, near the central column, a deep, fresh gouge in the ancient flagstones, as if something immense had scraped its way across. The edges of the scratch were sharp, raw, unlike the smooth wear of centuries. It wasn't wind, wasn't the sea. It was a guttural, hungry sound that vibrated in his chest, shaking him to the core. A violent gust of wind, seemingly generated from within the enclosed space, ripped through the chamber. It wasn't the steady push of a draft, it was a focused, malevolent shove that sent Chen reeling. A large section of plaster, weakened by the new cracks, detached from the ceiling and crashed to the floor, narrowly missing his head. Dust exploded upwards, choking him, stinging his eyes. He choked. Coughing, trying to wipe the grit away, but another unseen force slammed into his back, sending him sprawling. He could hear the grinding now, a constant, sickening sound of stone against stone, metal against metal. The lighthouse wasn't just crumbling, it was being actively dismantled from within. The border checkpoint was failing. He found it, flickering it back to life, its beam weak and wavering. He could feel the vibrations through the floor, a constant, low thrum that spoke of immense power. A section of the spiral staircase leading to the lantern room above buckled with a groan of stressed iron, a few steps sagging ominously. He had to get out, but a primal urge, a cartographer's stubborn need to understand the terrain, anchored him. This wasn't just a place, it was a diagram, a map coming to horrifying life. He needed to find the heart of this border checkpoint, the precise point of its breach. His gaze fell upon the immense, reinforced door that led to the lower levels, the parts of the lighthouse he hadn't yet fully explored, the true foundations. As he watched, a thin, black fissure, like a jagged seam, began to spread across the heavy timber and iron of the door. It wasn't a natural crack, it was too precise, too stark. The entity wasn't just breaking out, it was breaking through. And Chen, caught in its collapsing cage, was directly in its path. The light wasn't a guide, it was a cage. The thought had chilled him to the bone, but now, a strange, burning clarity ignited his resolve. He understood. And Chen, in his naive efforts to restore it, had begun to dismantle that boundary, thread by painstaking thread. He scrambled down the spiral staircase, the iron echoing his urgency. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of brine and something else, a faint, metallic tang, like old blood, that prickled the inside of his nostrils. They scraped at the edges of his hearing, 1,000 tiny voices trying to unspool his thoughts, to plant seeds of doubt and despair. You are alone. You are lost. It is already here. He burst into the ground floor, bypassing the main entrance, heading straight for the concealed trapdoor beneath the old keeper's desk. A single, bare bulb, rigged months ago, cast a feeble yellow glow, illuminating a massive, intricate arrangement of gears, chains, and levers embedded directly into the bedrock foundation. These weren't for a foghorn or a light rotation, they were too heavy, too deeply anchored. This was the lighthouse's true heart, its forgotten purpose. One lever, thicker and more pitted than the rest, caught his eye. It was forged from black iron, shaped like a ship's wheel spoke, and locked into place by a corroded bronze pin. The journal had described it as the primary key, the final lock. He pulled at the pin, his fingers scraping against jagged rust. It wouldn't budge. Frustration flared, hot and sharp. Suddenly, the single bulb flickered, then dimmed, plunging the sub-basement into a sickly twilight. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, cloying. He heard a wet, dragging sound from somewhere above, a sound too heavy to be a rat, too deliberate to be the wind. He gripped a heavy wrench he'd foresightly brought down with him. With a grunt, he jammed its head under the bronze pin and leveraged it. The metal shrieked, protesting, then gave way with a sudden, tearing sound. The pin flew free, clattering on the stone floor. He seized the heavy lever. He pulled. It resisted, groaning, the ancient gears above his head grinding like tectonic plates shifting. Dust, thick and suffocating, rained down, mingling with something else fine, black flakes that sparkled faintly in the dim light, like powdered obsidian. They accused him, mocked him, told him he was mad. His own memories began to fray, details blurring, faces dissolving into featureless blurs. The entity was attacking, trying to dismantle his internal border checkpoint, to erase him from the inside out. He pushed back against the mental assault, focusing on the sheer physical effort. He leaned his entire weight into the lever, his muscles screaming. Inch by agonizing inch, the lever moved. With each degree of rotation, the air pressure in the sub-basement seemed to drop, sucking the breath from his lungs. The sounds from above intensified, a wet, rhythmic thudding, as if something immense and shapeless were slithering down the spiral stairwell, closer, always closer. Then, as the lever reached its apex of travel, a faint, almost imperceptible glow emanated from the deep cracks in the surrounding bedrock. It was a pale, phosphorescent blue, pulsing with a slow, deliberate rhythm. It wasn't light escaping, it was light being drawn in. Chen, gasping for breath, looked closer at the iron lever, now fully engaged. Scarcely visible beneath centuries of grime, a series of symbols had been etched into its surface. He traced them with a trembling finger. They weren't words, but a sequence of interlocking geometric shapes, echoing the patterns on the ancient maps he'd studied. And at the center, a single, stark image, an eye, not open, but closed, with lines radiating inward. The journal had spoken of drawing the light to itself. He had misunderstood. The lighthouse's beam wasn't meant to illuminate the outside, but to contain what was within. The light, the very essence of its purpose, had to be turned inward, folded back upon itself, a self-consuming beacon. The thudding stopped. The air went utterly still. Then, a profound, guttural sigh vibrated through the stone, a sound of immense, ancient frustration, of something vast and formless being pressed back, contained. The blue light in the bedrock intensified, pulsing faster, drawing everything towards it. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside him, vibrating through his bones. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that the entity was fighting back, trying to force the lever undone, to push him away. The floor beneath him vibrated violently, rattling his teeth. Dust and black flakes rained down in a torrent. He held the lever, locking his arms, digging his feet into the damp earth, refusing to yield. He was the final barrier. He was the border checkpoint. The blue light pulsed, drawing, pulling, sealing. The shriek from the entity became a ragged, desperate moan, then slowly, agonizingly, began to recede, fading into a low, mournful drone. The vibrations lessened. The blue light still pulsed, but with a calmer, steadier rhythm. He had bought himself time, perhaps. But at what cost, and for how long? He tore away the rotted rug, wrenched open the heavy wooden trapdoor. A gust of stale, earthy air, thick with the scent of damp rock and something metallic, like old blood on rusted iron, billowed up. He hesitated for only a breath, then plunged into the profound gloom. The descent was a winding, narrow shaft, carved not with tools but by the slow, grinding erosion of the earth itself. The air grew heavy, pressing in on him, stealing the breath from his lungs. His hand, slick with nervous sweat, traced the rough-hewn stone walls as he lowered himself, foot by tentative foot, into the absolute darkness. The passage terminated in a low-ceilinged chamber, barely large enough to stand upright. Before him stood a structure unlike anything he had ever encountered in his cartographic studies. It was a massive, arching gate of dark, pitted stone, interwoven with thick, oxidized copper bands that pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. This was not merely a door, it was a threshold, a definitive boundary. He understood then. This was the place where the entity's influence was meant to be arrested, its passage into the world beyond the lighthouse strictly controlled. And he, Chen, was its new keeper, its unwilling gatekeeper. A pedestal stood before the gate, upon which rested a complex array of levers and dials, all crusted with centuries of salt and neglect. The lower mechanism was a bewildering console of containment. He studied the journal's final, frantic entries, cross-referencing the diagrams with the controls before him. Each lever, each dial, seemed to correspond to a specific seal or ward. The instructions were maddeningly vague, written in a metaphorical language of binding echoes and severing threads. A low hum, a deep resonance that vibrated through the stone floor and up into his bones, began to emanate from the gate. It was the entity, roused, aware of his presence, sensing his intent. He reached for the first lever, a heavy brass handle shaped like a stylized serpent. His fingers trembled, the cold metal biting into his skin. He pulled. A grinding groan echoed from within the gate, and a faint, high-pitched keening sound, like a soul being stretched thin, filled the chamber. Memories, his own precious memories, the scent of his grandfather's pipe tobacco, the feel of his mother's hand, the quiet joy of discovering a forgotten map in a dusty archive, flickered, threatened by erasure. Each action was met with increasing resistance, a palpable surge of malevolent energy. The gate glowed brighter, the copper bands pulsing with an angry, sickly green light. He saw spectral figures flicker at the periphery of his vision, faceless, formless, reaching. They were the echoes, the forgotten, the consumed. He felt the entity probing, searching for weakness. It was trying to unravel him, to make him forget why he was here, who he was. He focused on the lighthouse, on the cold stone, on the map in his mind, the one he had drawn of this place, this trap. He held on to the tangible, the real. The final dial was stiff, refusing to turn. He braced himself, gritting his teeth, and put his full weight into it. The chamber roared. The gate shuddered violently, throwing stone dust into the air. The entity's rage was a palpable force, a hurricane of psychic screaming that threatened to tear his mind apart. He felt a sharp, searing pain behind his eyes, a sensation of being stretched thin, like an old parchment pulled taut to the point of tearing. He cried out, a guttural sound torn from his throat. Then, with a final, agonizing click, the dial engaged. The roar ceased. The keening faded. The spectral figures vanished. Chen collapsed against the pedestal, his legs giving out. His body ached, every muscle screaming in protest. His mind, though, was the real battlefield. He felt a significant portion of himself, a vital part of his inner landscape, felt gone. Not forgotten, not erased, but taken. He tried to recall the specifics of his childhood home, the exact shade of blue of his mother's favorite vase, the precise contours of his first, most cherished map. The details were hazy, blurred at the edges, like photographs left too long in the sun. He had paid the price. He pushed himself up, trembling, and stumbled back to the gate. The entity was contained. But he was not free. He was bound. His cartographers I saw a new map spread before him, not of distant lands, but of an endless, solitary vigil. He slowly ascended the passage, each step a testament to his profound exhaustion, his sacrifice. It no longer guided ships, it held something back. And he, Chen, was its prisoner, its guardian.